Questions persist about parental rights and gender identity at school. Trump takes action against birth tourism. Billions of your tax dollars are going to NGOs, and states continue pushing for EV rebates. Welcome to the States, powered by the Center Square. It's Monday, August 10th, 2026, and I'm your host, Greg Bishop. The Liberty Justice Center filed an amicus brief asking the U.S. Supreme Court to review a case challenging a Maryland public school district's policy that requires teachers to use students' preferred pronouns, claiming that the policy violates the constitutional rights of teachers and parents. Now, that amicus brief, which translates to a friend of the court brief, supporting the petition, it comes after the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit upheld the policy in Polk versus Montgomery County Public Schools. Now, the school district's policy requires staff to use students' requested names and pronouns, including those that differ from a student's biological sex, and not to disclose that information to parents on confidentiality grounds, unless it's formally requested. Now, the Center Square education reporter Esther Wickham reports that the case centers on a substitute teacher, Kimberly Polk, who objected to the policy on religious grounds. Back in February, the Fourth Circuit ruled the policy did not violate Polk's rights to free speech or the free exercise of religion. Now, this case also pointed to the outcome in Marabelli versus Bonta. That's a case at the beginning of this year that's involved parents and educators challenging California's policy that allowed public schools to withhold information from parents about a student's gender identity. Now, after an emergency application was sent to the Supreme Court ruled that parents are likely to succeed on their constitutional claims and have that district's policies likely violating First and 14th Amendments. Now, the amicus brief filed last week, it cites this case and another reason why parents should be not excluded from important mental health decisions for their children. Now, on Friday, I talked with an attorney from the Liberty Justice Center about how this issue is playing out beyond the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining us to discuss the issue of what parents have a right to know from their school district is Liberty Justice Center Senior Counsel Timothy Snowball. Tim, thanks for taking time here with the states. What is being hidden from parents, and where exactly is this happening?
Well, Greg, thanks so much for having me on. Welcome to 2026, I guess, where school districts are taking it upon themselves not only to take liberties with your children in terms of their sexuality and gender, but also to keep it a secret from you, unfortunately. We just earlier in the week, released a series of letters to 4 attorney generals of several different states, Washington State, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey, who, believe it or not, all have state policies whereby if your child is experiencing some kind of gender dysphoria, they can socially transition at school, and the school has a policy at the state level to keep that a secret from you. So if your child takes this upon themselves, the school will back up your child and let them make the decision about what to tell you instead of giving it to the parents.
So are we just talking about a teacher or an administrator looking the other way when a child decides to identify a certain way, or are there policies encouraging such behavior, regardless of how the parents may react?
Yeah, you actually have policies at the state level promulgated from the state and sent down to the school districts, whereby it's not only a matter of looking the other way, these schools at the teachers, administrator levels actually have to take proactive action at the behest of the child. So if your child decides that they're going to stop going by Andrew and start going by Eileen, then the school has to actually accept that new name, let them access potentially different bathroom accommodations, different sports accommodations. And so it's very much an active participation in this child's social transition.
So I want to talk a little bit about the rights that you guys are saying are being violated by these districts, but a lot of this has changed since recent U.S. Supreme Court's precedent here. Tell us about that case and how this is rippling across the country.
Yeah, you actually had a case, that's what makes this really interesting, earlier this year called Marabelli versus Bonta, here from my home state of California, where the U.S. Supreme Court just came down on the side of parents and said that school districts can no longer do this kind of thing. And they based that case on 2 different constitutional principles. The first being a free exercise principle, the First Amendment, that parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children when it comes to their religious beliefs. And believe it or not, many Americans still believe that there are 2 sexes in our species. And the other part of it being a due process, which is the idea that parents and not the state are the ones who are responsible for directing the upbringing of children. So it makes it even more kind of injurious, I think, that these 4 states that we sent these letters to are still doing these policies because the U.S. Supreme Court just answered the question. And so to me, it looks like them simply purposely flouting what the Supreme Court has said is required.
So for families out there not familiar with the different types of policies there may be, even federal protections that there may be, tell us about the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act.
Yeah, so you mentioned FERPA. So not only do we have this entire constitutional realm to this issue, but we also have a federal statutory realm. FERPA is a federal law on the books by which parents are supposed to be able to access the records regarding their children in school. And so what it looks like in terms of these cases is that not only are the schools keeping these gender issues a secret from parents, violating constitutional law, but also statutory law. And as we know, whether you reference the Cass report, which came out several years ago regarding gender dysphoria, this is a serious mental condition and mental stress that these children are going through who are experiencing gender dysphoria. And there's all kinds of comorbidities, depression, anxiety, all these different things. And I think the point of this is if your child was experiencing any other kind of mental stress or mental issue at school, the schools would just automatically tell you about it. But they've simply carved out some kind of special category for gender dysphoria. And as you mentioned, violates federal law and constitutional law.
Well, Tim, you guys sent these demand letters. First off, what exactly is a demand letter for people who aren't attorneys? And what are you guys demanding?
Well, I think the demand letter is, you think of that as an easy way to try to get something done without having to file a lawsuit, right? So if you don't want to sue somebody, you send a demand letter and say, hey, I'm going to point out your unconstitutional action or your illegal action and ask you to kind of fix it without me having to haul you into court. So for those 4 states that we sent these demand letters to, we pointed out the unconstitutionality of the policies they have and asked them to voluntarily fix them. And we pointed out that when it comes to federal law is supreme, and states can enact all kinds of different things that they think might be a good idea, but if their policies run afoul of the federal First Amendment or other statutory guarantees, that the federal law actually prevails. And so our hope would be that these 4 states that we sent these letters to would voluntarily comply and go ahead and let the school districts know they have to follow the federal Constitution. But if they don't do that, we're hoping to hear from folks and families who may be affected in those states, and we might have to think about further legal action.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the consequence would be, but you essentially spelled that out. You've got the demand letter asking nicely for them to comply, and if they don't comply, there could be litigation coming down the pike for these 4 states. Have you guys heard anything back? It's been a few days here. Have you heard anything back from representatives from these attorneys general offices?
Haven't heard anything back besides just acknowledgments that the letters had been received, and that's very much in line. We had previously sent one of these letters to the state of California, my home state, who has a very egregious policy that's similar to what we're talking about here. Haven't heard anything back, but that's pretty normal. But what we did hear from was a whole host of families who had been affected in California, and so still, when you're talking about these different states, we're talking about dozens and dozens of schools. In the case of New Jersey, over 130 schools where children are being affected by this. And so we're hoping to hear back from some families who are affected and see if they want to do something about it.
We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on this, a parental rights issue. You can read more about at thecentersquare.com. Timothy Snowball, Senior Counsel for the Liberty Justice Center. Greatly appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Wealthy people are building businesses around birthright citizenship. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's a disgrace. They're buying their way in, and we're not going to let it happen.
That was President Donald Trump last week, taking executive action to curb what he says is abuse of the nation's immigration system. Welcome back to the States. I'm Greg Bishop. Now, following the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that overturned the president's executive order banning birthright citizenship, the president's taking another stab at curbing the practice through a pair of executive orders. The Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief Sarah Roderick Fitch reports Trump signed the latest executive orders Thursday afternoon targeting birth tourism, diplomats, and enemies of the U.S. from taking advantage of the Constitution's 14th Amendment. Here's Trump's staff secretary, Will Scharf, explaining part of that order.
We look very heavily at denying visas to people that we have reason to believe are coming here for that purpose. Visas both for putative parents, but also for the people organizing these rings. There's also obviously a law enforcement component. We'll have a full fact sheet released on this soon, but what we're doing is taking legally validated means that are clearly within our disposal and targeting them square on to this birth tourism industry.
By the way, Scharf was just announced as the new White House counsel. Now, the president has been critical of birthright citizenship and birth tourism, arguing that the amendment was meant to ensure children born of enslaved people were entitled to citizenship, not bad actors who entered the U.S. illegally or purposefully to have a child here. Now, White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Stephen Miller, he said the president's taking action to prohibit abuses of foreign nationals coming to the U.S. to birth their children.
It gives them access under this broken system to welfare benefits, ultimately to the voting booth, and all the other rights and privileges that belong solely to Americans. So that practice of birth tourism is, as of the signing of this order, hereby banned. I would put this in the top 3 in terms of importance because it ends what has been one of the gravest and most egregious abuses of the American system.
The order describes the practice as schemes, which has produced thriving industries around the world that profit by enabling the evasion of American immigration law to obtain citizenship and other immigration benefits. Now, Miller, he said this action is within the president's authority.
The president is using his authority as commander-in-chief to sign first an executive order using the new ruling the Supreme Court issued to expand the definitions of people who are ineligible for birthright citizenship. That includes, for example, alien enemies of the United States, members of foreign terrorist organizations, and large categories of people who lobby and act on behalf of foreign governments. And so with taking this action, it ensures that large numbers of people who wrongly would be getting birthright citizenship will no longer be eligible for those benefits.
Now, not everyone sees it's within the president's authority to act this way. U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, he put out a statement saying that birthright citizenship is the law of the land, which the Supreme Court just upheld in June. Durbin went on to say, but President Donald Trump and Stephen Miller's anti-immigrant agenda will never miss a chance to sow doubt and fear in immigrant communities. Durbin said the Trump administration should abandon this latest shameful attempt to subvert the Constitution, federal statutes, and clear Supreme Court precedents. Now, Miller, he said Trump's action isn't just about birthright citizenship, it's about curbing abuses elsewhere throughout the law.
For the first time ever in American history, to ban birth tourism. So I want you to really let that sink in. This has been something that people have talked about not only for years, but for decades. The idea that people come here pretending to be a tourist, pretending to be a visitor, saying they want to go to Disneyland, they want to go visit a monument or go to a national park, but the real reason they're here is to have a child, to make that child an automatic citizen, leave our country, and then have a U.S. citizen child. It gives them access under this broken system to welfare benefits, ultimately to the voting booth, and all the other rights and privileges that belong solely to Americans. So that practice of birth tourism is, as of the signing of this order, hereby banned.
Now, Trump described June's Supreme Court ruling, Trump versus Barbera, as a very unfortunate decision, adding that his administration is making adjustments to curb that practice. Read more about that at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more from the States. Well, in the past decade, government grants to nonprofits and the number of nonprofits that receive tax dollars has doubled. That's raising questions about whether taxpayer money is being wasted. That's according to the latest investigation by the Center Square Enterprise and Investigating Unit. Welcome back to the States. I'm Greg Bishop. Joining us to discuss this is managing editor of the Center Square's EIU team, Art Kane. Art, this is the first in a series of stories that's going to be ongoing here, looking into all of these tax dollars that are going out to nonprofits. What are readers going to get from this series?
Well, we're hoping readers will get the facts, because there's been a lot of back and forth about, NGOs and nonprofits wasting money. And so we decided to do a systematic look at it and see what kind of money is being used and whether it's being used properly.
Now, obviously, 1 year is just 1 year, but you guys went back and found all of the spending from 2016 on up. What's incredible here is the sheer scope. How much money are we talking about?
We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars flooding into nonprofits, particularly starting in 2020 when the COVID stuff happened. I think the floodgates just opened with government money just going into nonprofits, and I don't think there was a lot of accountability, which is what we're interested in. What was the money spent for? What was it used for? And was it audited and made sure to be used for proper things, or was it wasted?
And some of the numbers you guys found, for instance, in 2016, $149 billion going to nonprofits, and about 56,000 nonprofits getting some of those funds. By 2022, that number was up to $319 billion with over 100,000 nonprofits. What kind of nonprofits are we talking about?
All kinds of nonprofits, from homeless nonprofits to nonprofits pushing trans issues to nonprofits doing medical things. I mean, there are, 110,000 nonprofits for us to look at that are getting all this government money. What are they spending on, and who's profiting out of it? Are they wasting the money, or are they actually doing something useful for society?
Yeah, I mean, going from 56,000 nonprofits in 2016 up to more than 100,000 nonprofits in just the span of less than 10 years, really, and the billions of dollars that continues to go out the door. But there seemed to be a bit of an ebb and flow in the annual amount you guys found. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's difficult because we're relying on 990 tax returns of nonprofits. Nonprofits don't have to pay in because they're nonprofit. So a lot of times they'll file a tax return a couple of years after the actual money is being spent and taken in. And so it's hard to say. So the last couple of years, I don't feel like the numbers are very good because a lot of those nonprofits probably haven't filed tax returns regularly in those years. But when you look at the difference between 2016, which is like $150 billion, which is still a phenomenal amount of money, and then you look at 2020 and 2023, where you're talking about $320 billion, you see the amount of money that's just flooding into the nonprofit sector. And my reporters and I want to know what that money's going for.
It's fascinating, too, is it's one thing to go and find the budgets of all of these individual states over each year. And the team has done that to a degree in some of these states, showing the increase in spending, like, for instance, in Illinois. But you guys are looking at these 990 forms, and it actually has some pretty revealing data for these nonprofits, including how much is being paid in salaries, how much of their total income's coming from taxpayer funds. Tell us a bit about some of that data you found.
Well, because they are nonprofit and they don't have to pay taxes, they are required to file their tax returns in a public manner. And fortunately, the IRS has those electronically. So we were able to get them into a huge database. All the nonprofits that have filed in the last 10 years were put into this database. And then we sorted and extracted the ones that had government money. Now, it's difficult to know which government it is because they don't have to go to the detailed level of, I got this money from the state or the city or whatever. It just says government grants. So we know they got government money. We know how much, but we don't know where it came from. And then additionally, we can look at their salaries of their top officials, and we can look at how they're spending it in general terms. Now, to dig deeper, we have to go to the states and find out what the contracts were, or the federal government or the cities, and find out what they were supposed to do for that money. And that takes a lot of work to do, and my guys have been pushing hard to get that information.
Yeah, and some of the data you've gleaned from all of the data you've already brought in, and anticipating there's going to be a truckload more of information on all of this. But 11,000 nonprofits, you showed that 10% receive taxpayer dollars. The 10% that do, they have at least one executive making over $300,000 in annual salaries. That just seems to kind of be the tip of the iceberg in how much of these nonprofits are using taxpayer dollars to operate.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're going to look at next is if you get a large percentage of your money from taxpayer dollars and all of a sudden all your executives are making high, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 that they couldn't make in a government job and probably couldn't make in the private sector, then the question is, if taxpayers aren't allowed to pay public officials $300,000 a year, and I don't think there's any governor in the country that makes that, why are they allowed to do these nonprofits, and what are these nonprofit people doing for it? It's really a significant question. It looks like the money is basically being funneled from the taxpayers to these nonprofit CEOs and other people. And what are the connections to the government officials? Do these nonprofit CEOs have any kind of personal or familial connection to the government that's giving them the money? Those are all things we're going to be looking into in the next months and year.
Yeah, there's no question it's going to take a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests to get to the bottom of these contracts. But we're already seeing some of these concerns you're elevating here in some federal charges that have been brought up, right? Even in Illinois, you've got State Representative Carol Ammons being charged with having a nonprofit to get state dollars that was paying her daughter. And then when it was found out that was a possible conflict, she somehow was able to steer that, allegedly, to a different nonprofit that would then pay her daughter. So you've got these types of questions. And even years ago, the possibility of using these nonprofits ahead of elections and using state dollars to give to these nonprofits. So some very important questions. But again, Art, there's a lot of data out there. You've got a call to action for people. Tell us what you're looking for readers to do if they suspect a nonprofit needs to be investigated.
Well, if you know of a nonprofit that's getting a lot of taxpayer money, we're not interested in nonprofits that are getting, go out and raise money from people who voluntarily give it. We want to look at people who are being forced to give it to taxpayers, whether they want to or not. But if you know a nonprofit that's doing something that you don't think is in the public interest and has a lot of government money, feel free to reach out and email me at akane@thecentersquare.com, and we'll put it on the list of ones to look into. It's when you have this much data, it's great to have this much data, but sometimes it's really hard to figure out which ones are the good ones and which ones are the questionable ones. And so any help we can get would be great.
So again, if you've got any information you want to pass along about the possibility of a nonprofit getting some taxpayer funds and they need to be scrutinized a bit further, be sure to send an email to Art at akane@thecentersquare.com. Art Kane, managing editor for the Enterprise Investigating Unit. We'll be hearing more about this developing story throughout the week. Greatly appreciate your time. After the federal government did a U-turn on using taxpayer dollars to incentivize electric vehicle purchases, several states continue to offer their own taxpayer-funded incentives. Welcome back to the States. I'm Greg Bishop. Officials in California, they say the sale of EVs in California has skyrocketed in recent years, and that's just them getting started. They say the zero-emission vehicles are no longer tomorrow's technology, that they're today's solution. But others point that such vehicles aren't really zero emissions, as the manufacturing process and the mining of materials to make EV batteries and other components can still add to pollution. But officials in California, they say that they've taken a step backwards with the loss of federal incentives that helps people purchase electric vehicles, which is why the state says they are now doing their own state-run program that's being announced, and they say it's very critical. Now, they say that even more Californians will have access to electric vehicles through the first EV program from the state of California. Governor Gavin Newsom, he said he favors choice, but he says California is set to use tax dollars to incentivize that choice.
This is about choice, giving people of our state a choice, but also giving them a head start by giving them this $3,500 incentive for new cars, $1,750 for used cars, for supporting California-based headquartered companies. Thank you to Rivian and Lucid, where no cap in terms of these investments are provided because we want to incentivize. Thank you to Ford for their R&D investments in Skunk Works down in Southern California. That's why I drove in on the Ford, appreciating that they recognize what's at stake.
As to the pushback against incentivizing such purchases of EVs, Newsom criticized oil companies that he said were leading that opposition.
We're on the other side of this debate. We're in the how business. This is about the great implementation. Alternative energy is fossil fuels, an inferior product. And that's why they're so desperate, big oil, the polluted heart of the climate crisis. They're so desperate to hold on to what they've got. And they got a bird in the hand by the name of Donald Trump. And they're squeezing him for everything they got. But we're not going to cede the future, and we're not going to sacrifice our children to those policies.
Note, Newsom talked about companies with headquarters in California. One in particular was Tesla.
Tesla would not exist without California's regulatory environment, period, full stop. It was because of the certainty of a regulatory environment that created the incentives for investors, eventually Elon, who picked up on the original investment, and he accelerated that. And so we want to continue to see that acceleration. And to the extent that the federal government's working to vandalize that mandate, which they are, that will play out in the courts, and we'll see where that process unfolds as it relates to California's authority. And as it relates to the next administration, they'll make that determination in response directly to your question.
But Tesla eventually moved out of California because of other policies placing burdens on businesses. To the critics who say Newsom's rhetoric hinting at telling businesses you didn't build that, Newsom had a response last week.
We're just jump-starting this, but it's ultimately not the state's job to build out that infrastructure, to create the conditions and the stability and the regulatory environment where we can make those investments flourish and thrive.
Now, it's not just California. New York State has given 106,000 electric vehicles rebates between the years 2017 and 2023. Their point of sale rebate between $500 to $2,000 is on eligible new electric vehicles or different types of vehicles, tiered primarily by all electric range and subject to the manufactured suggested retail price. In Colorado, they have their EV rebates, looking to increase those after the federal incentives went away. And at the end of last year, it was announced their rebates were increasing from $6,000 to $9,000 in Colorado for new EV purchases and leases, but $4,000 to $600 for used EV purchases and leases. In previous years, Colorado spent $9 million on electric vehicle rebates for gas, diesel, and other different types of trade-ins. In Washington state, a previous $45 million EV rebate program appeared to be exhausted by high-income earners, and some analysts said that Elon Musk's Tesla was the biggest beneficiary of that Washington state EV mandate program. Now, from 2019 through 2023, Washington state had given 25,200 EV sales and use tax exemptions since 2019. Texas had given over 6,700 electric vehicle rebate credits for a total of around $16 million, and that was just in 2023. Maryland gave over 12,800 EV rebates for a total of $28 million. Again, that was in 2023. Oregon also giving out tens of thousands of EV rebates worth $78 million between 2018 and 2023. In Illinois, They had a $19 million EV rebate program in 2023, and records showed that there were luxury EV models that were parts of that program. But there are new limits on the price of the vehicle in Illinois. Their new EV rebate program that's began opening its door August 1st. It gives rebates for vehicles with a selling price not to exceed $80,000. Now, the Illinois rebates are $2,000 for an eligible new or used electric vehicle. There's also income thresholds. Low-income applicants, they're eligible to receive an additional $2,000 for a total of $4,000 in EV rebates. Now, the rebate amount for eligible motorcycles is $1,500. Now, income caps are also being applied to this process in Illinois. Ineligible applicants defined as persons and families whose income does not exceed 500% of the federal poverty line for the current state fiscal year. And that rebate amount for eligible motorcycles, again, remains at $1,500 despite income. Now, the Illinois General Assembly, they did approve for this fiscal year with the no federal funds available for EV rebates. It's going to be state funds, $14 million going to the Illinois EPA for the current fiscal year that ends June 30th of 2027. So that application cycle this time around, again, opened August 1st in Illinois. It's set to close at the end of the year. In previous years, they gave tens of thousands of rebates out in the span of several years. Just in 1 year alone, they had over 3,400 applications with over 3,000 rebates issued, totaling millions of dollars. Now, think about the Trump administration coming in when they said that they're not going to continue going down the road of EV rebates, and they repealed a lot of that. Well, it's led to even some consternation and conflict between the president and Elon Musk, who is upset that the federal government was steering away from tax rebates and incentives for electric vehicles. Despite all of that, in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, he said his state's push, it's going to outlast Trump.
We're past the debate, and we're just trying to hold this together because we've got an invasive species in the spirit of the conversation in Donald Trump in the White House. The good news, he's lame duck. The good news, he's temporary. The good news is California's policies will continue well past his tenure.
Do you have an electric vehicle? Did you get a rebate? If so, how much? And let us know in the comments below if you think taxpayers should incentivize the industry, or if you believe the free market should dictate the winners and losers. We'll be right back with more from the States. Welcome back to the States. Now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines from across the country that you can find in the description below or in your inbox with the Center Square newsletter, free at thecentersquare.com. Background checks in July surged to record-breaking levels in Colorado before a new law came into effect to increase regulations on buying certain semi-automatic firearms. The Center Square contributor Liam Hibbert reports, in the lead-up to the law's implementation, the month of July saw nearly 60,000 background checks performed, almost triple the figure from the year prior, according to the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. Colorado does not track firearm sales, but background checks are required for firearm sales. Opponents of the state law, they call it unconstitutional, while supporters argue it would keep some of the most dangerous weapons out of the wrong hands. Now, in the lead up to its implementation over the weekend, gun owners rushed to purchase firearms before the new restrictions went into place. Now, the law was pushed back in 2025, but it did not go into effect until August 1st. The law concerns semi-automatic firearms, specifically those that use detachable magazines. It requires people who purchase them to complete a safety course and test and it gives sheriffs the ability to block people's access to those guns. 2 donors said that they had never before made a political donation. Another said, look, where I'm living, when asked if he made 7,878 donations worth $93,000. And many more in Wisconsin. They confirmed that they had not donated nearly as much as had been claimed in federal donation filings to Act Blue with that Federal Election Commission filing. Now, the Center Square reporter John Stife tells us all of this came from multiple reports from a group of private investigators led by Kyle Corrigan of Bright Line Investigations into Democratic fundraising platform Act Blue's political donations in Wisconsin that were shared with the Center Square. Corrigan said the 2 reports, one in 2023, another in 2025, were updates on an ongoing look into a practice referred to as smurfing. And that's where the group's accused of attributing more donations and higher dollar amounts to individual donors than they can actually give in the process, and it could shield other donors from complete transparency. Now, Corrigan wrote in his recent report that the donations could be qualified as both identity theft and money laundering. He wrote that the prior claims were sent to the Door County Sheriff's Office in 2023, but they were not investigated. Within a wave of new Illinois laws signed late last week exist some which may impact Illinoisans' pocketbooks, including further regulations on Medicare drug prices. Other laws will allow rideshare drivers to unionize and ban ICE detention centers from being built in some parts of the state. Now, the Center Square Illinois reporter Sean Reed reports Governor J.B. Pritzker announced late Friday he signed more than 75 bills from the Illinois General Assembly's spring legislative session. Among those signed are bills that put in places new guardrails around the federal 340B drug program and requires a departmental study of the federal 340B drug program to determine how it's working for Illinoisans. Another measure signed, HB 5090, this is the Transportation Network Driver Labor Relations Act, and that will allow many Illinois-based drivers for apps like Uber and Lyft to unionize. HB 5024 would prevent the construction of new immigration and customs enforcement detention centers in certain places, and that was also signed by the governor. That law prevents new immigration detention facilities from being built within 1,500 feet of a variety of places common in urban environments, but it doesn't ban them outright. And voters supports Florida's Amendment 3. That's the property tax relief proposal, and it remains high despite pushback from various organizations. The Center Square contributor Marilee Gasser reports a poll released this month shows 74% of respondents support the proposal to significantly reduce or eliminate property taxes on homestead residences. Now, this proposal needs just 60% of the vote in Florida to pass. Cost of living is at the top of voters' minds heading into Election Day, with 94% of respondents saying costs in Florida are increasing. And when asked what they felt was the primary driver of housing affordability issues, 15% said property taxes. Another 20% blamed insurance rates, and 19% said it was property insurance. Now, if passed, Amendment 3 would increase the homestead tax exemption for non-school taxes to $150,000 in 2027 and $250,000 in 2028. Passage of the amendment will reduce local revenue by nearly an estimated $12 billion annually, according to the Florida Policy Institute. Now, the wide support from voters stands in contrast to multiple organizations that have spoken out in opposition to the property tax relief proposals. We'll be watching that story closely. And that's just some of what America is talking about. Now, get those and other headlines at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you can join us back here Tuesday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from all across the country, only with the states, powered by the Center Square.